Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York here in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's special event is entitled Beyond All Binaries, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, the German Jewish queer rights activist who took on the Nazis, featuring Daniel Brook, author of The Einstein of Sex, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, visionary of Weimar, Berlin. And he'll discuss how and why Hirschfeld's research about sexual orientation, gender, and race has much to teach us as we face down book bans and weaponized xenophobia today. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, was first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today we identify those crimes for what they are, mass atrocities and genocide. These horrors can continue to have devastating political, social, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. Today's event is part of a special collaboration between the KHC and Queensborough Community College's LGBTQI+ Consortium, the English Department, the Communication, Theater, and Media Production Department, and the Pride Center. Our event is also co-sponsored by 8 organizations around the country, and they include the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center in White Plains, the Center for Genocide and Human Rights Research in Africa and the Diaspora at Northeastern Illinois University, the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University, the Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, the Reef Center for Human Rights and Conflict Resolution at Christopher Newport University, the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University, the Cohen Institute for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College, and the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University. I'd like to thank Lamar Green, coordinator of QCC's Pride Center, Julian Jimenez, professor and chairperson of Queensborough's Communication, Theater, and Media Production Department, Danny Sexton, associate professor of English at QCC, Phil Roncaroni, Jesse Pina, and Mahir Hossein from the Media Services and Transformation Department, and Barana Soman, the KHC's museum coordinator. Finally, before I pass it along, a few notes. And the first is a reminder for those of you attending in person to please turn your phones off. Second, after the presentation, we'll host a brief Q&A. For those of you watching online, please drop your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll also pass the mic around for those of you attending in person if you have any questions. And third, for those of you online, in the chat, we'll have a copy of a flyer for Daniel Brook's book that you can purchase at a discount. And for those of you here in person, we also have copies available on a first-come, first-served basis. So now that I've said all those things, it's my great pleasure to welcome my colleague, Lamar Green, coordinator of QCC's Pride Center.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lamar Green, as Laura mentioned. I'm the coordinator for the Pride Center here at Queensborough Community College, and I'm also our representative this year for the CUNY LGBTQIA+ Consortium, and we are so happy to be here, to be a co-sponsor and a part of this event. Thank you to everyone at the KHC, Laura and the team, for hosting us in your space, and for having us be a part of such a wonderful event. Just a little bit about the CUNY LGBTQIA+ Consortium and its presence on campus. It is an initiative and a grant from the City Council, and it is for us to have a representation and archive LGBTQ+ history that's happening through events, programming, special occurrences and different things like that where we talk about history, culture, and society like we are doing today. So we're exactly excited to have this be an opportunity to be a part of the grant and the work that we're doing this year. We're so excited to have Daniel for the book talk and to learn more about Dr. Hirschfeld and his work. And without further ado, we're going to pass it along to my colleague, Danny Sexton from the English Department.
Thank you, Lamar. I'm here to introduce our speaker, Daniel Brook, who was born in Brooklyn, raised on Long Island, educated at Yale, and lives in New Orleans. He is an acclaimed journalist and author of the following books: A History of Future Cities, The Accident of Color, and The Einstein of Sex. His works have appeared in Harper's, The New Yorker, Architectural Record, Foreign Policy, and the New York Times Magazine. He has received numerous research awards and research grants, including the Ina and Robert Caro Research Travel Fellowship, the Winter House Award for Design, Writing, and Criticism, and Yale University's John Herscher Prize. A History of Future Cities was named one of the 10 favorite books of the year by the Washington Post, featured on the cover of the Times Literary Supplement, and long-listed for the Lionel Gerber Prize, awarded to the best foreign affairs books published in the English language each year. We are exceptionally pleased to have him here today to deliver his talk that Dr. Cohen has already given us the title of, Beyond All Binaries. Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, the German Jewish queer rights activist who took on the Nazis. So join me in welcoming Daniel Brook.
Thank you so much, Danny, for that very generous introduction. Thank you, Lamar, for co-hosting this event, and Dr. Laura for hosting it. It's very meaningful for me in particular to be here today. I was first on this campus as a teenager. Before this center existed, there was the precursor of it, which was essentially in the library basement. And I was a Jewish teenager growing up on Long Island and got some of my first Holocaust education in that library basement. It's such an honor to come back here now as a Holocaust educator myself. Today I'm going to do something unconventional. I'm not going to read at you very much, maybe a little bit. Instead, I'm going to give you a visual introduction to the life and thought of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld that elucidates his core idea, beyond all binaries, where others were looking at the world's human populations and seeing divisions of us and them on the basis of sexual orientation, gender, and race. He saw humanity as a seamless continuum. Now begin explaining how that goes through my visual presentation. I imagine many of us are familiar with this event. It's one of the most awful and traumatic of the 20th century. It's the Nazi book burning in the heart of Berlin. But what we might not know, and what I didn't know until I began this research project, was whose books were being burned. So you can see the image at the right of the screen, those are Hitler Youth opening a book by Magnus Hirschfeld to the frontispiece where his portrait takes place. The Nazi book burning involved Magnus Hirschfeld's bust on a pike. This was seized from his Institute for Sexual Science. He had built a museum, think tank, clinic, both psychological and surgical, called the Institute for Sexual Science in the middle of Berlin. In May 1933, 2 months after Hitler seized power, the Nazis raided the institute, took files, and took books, took over 20,000 volumes of books that they burned in the heart of Berlin that night. You can imagine Magnus Hirschfeld was a key enemy of the Nazis because he was Jewish, gay, a democratic socialist, a scientist, an intellectual. The list goes on and on and on. But what the Nazis most feared about Magnus Hirschfeld was his thinking outside all boxes. Instead of seeing the world divided into us and them, he saw the continuum of we. This begins with his very first publication in 1896, first scientific publication. He'd actually been a freelance stringer for German newspapers based in Chicago in his wild younger years. This is his 1896 pamphlet, Sappho and Socrates, or What Explains the Love of People for Their Own Sex. It's a gay rights pamphlet. He initially wrote it under a pseudonym as an anonymous Berlin physician. He later republishes it in the second edition publicly as himself. And it's advocating for the repeal of paragraph 175 This is the provision of the German legal code that made it a crime punishable by imprisonment for a man to have sex with a man. In the pamphlet, he creates this scientific chart where where each person can chart their individual level of sexual attraction to their own sex and to the opposite sex. Already he's seeing, instead of a gay-straight binary, he's seeing at the beyond even a sort of gay-straight bisexual trinary, he's seeing everyone as sexually unique with their own admixture of same-sex and opposite-sex attraction. In 1904, he does the world's first, to that point, most comprehensive study to try to ascertain the queer percentage of the population. He sends out these survey cards, first to a group of boys' technical high school students at a kind of Brooklyn science kind of magnet school, and then later to a metal workers union that was aligned with the Social Democratic Party. For the first survey, he asked the students to underline whether they're attracted, this works in English and German because the languages are closely related, women, men, or women and men. For the second survey with the metal workers, he gives a new instruction. Don't just underline if you're most attracted to men, women, or women and men, but if you're attracted to both women and men, put a double underline under the sex to which you're attracted more, if applicable. Again, beyond all binaries. Magnus Hirschfeld and a group of professional and aristocratic gay men found something called the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. It's the Western world's first gay rights organization. It's founded in Magnus Hirschfeld's apartment in Berlin in 1898. And then a few years later, in 1904, one of the founders of this organization, an aristocrat named the Baron von Teschenberg, submits this portrait to Magnus Hirschfeld and says, "This is my true nature, this trans portrait," and says, "And I want you to publish it in the Scientific Humanitarian Committee's scientific journal, the Journal of Sexual Intermediaries." So what had begun as a campaign of gay men to change the paragraph 175 law had become something different. Baron von Teschenberg was not a gay man. Baron von Teschenberg was trans. This spurs Magnus Hirschfeld to begin counseling trans patients. From the very start of his, after his medical training and this brief interlude as a journalist in the United States, he opens up a medical practice. His father had been a doctor, his brothers were doctors. His father had been an obstetrician, his late father. So Magnus Hirschfeld actually hangs his late father's sign, Dr. Hirschfeld, obstetrician, in front of his practice. Now, Magnus Hirschfeld was not an obstetrician. Magnus Hirschfeld did not deliver babies, but he thought by identifying with obstetrics, he could signal very quietly that his medical practice was one that would deal with sexual matters. And soon, a parade of queer patients are beating a path to his door. Many are closeted gay men who are terrified of paragraph 175, which opens up all kinds of possibilities for blackmail. Some are lesbians, and he's guiding them all towards self-acceptance. When they ask him what they need to be fixed, he says, "Oh, maybe a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Oh, and by the way, did you know that this bar by the harbor on Wednesday nights after 10 p.m. might be a place where a young woman like you might be able to find a girlfriend?" So he's counseling them towards self-acceptance. And as he encounters more queer patients and more trans patients, he begins to amass case studies, and he puts out this work, the transvestites is the title, not a word we would use today. He coins this word, but it's a study of 18 case studies of trans individuals, 17 of whom had been assigned male at birth, one of whom had been assigned female at birth, and their story is really fantastic. It involves circumnavigating the globe on a Norwegian whaling ship and all kinds of antics. Ends up in Berlin and is discovered. There's a scandal in the local paper. They're working as a house painter and are discovered to be having an affair with the lady of the house. And it's a big tabloid story. And before this individual absconds again briefly. They go to Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, who gets their story down and publishes it in this first sympathetic study of trans individuals in Western history. In the book, in the Die Transvestiten, Hirschfeld argues that masculinity and femininity can express themselves in so many different ways in a human being. The physical, the social, the emotional, and that when you actually look at each individual human's gender expression in each of the different facets, you get over 43 million personalities, 43 million possibilities. There are 43 million different admixtures of masculinity and femininity that can exist in any given human. And he has an artist friend of his create this portrait of the absolute man and the absolute woman. So 1 out of every 43 million humans is masculine in every aspect of his physicality and personality, and it's this bearded fellow. And then 1 out of every 43 million humans is feminine in every aspect of her physicality, sociability, cultural interests, and that's this blonde lady on your right, and everyone else is some other mixture of masculinity and femininity. So essentially, in the Northeast Corridor from Boston to Washington, there's one of this guy, there's one of this woman, everyone else is some other mixture of masculinity and femininity, their own unique mixture. Hirschfeld is a scientist and a psychotherapist. He's also a public figure. As I said, he initially began with this anonymous pamphlet. 2 years later, in the second edition, he comes out of the closet, if you will, and puts out the second edition under his own name. And he becomes Germany's leading queer rights activist. He puts out publications aimed at the general public, including this one on your left that's translates as Berlin's Third Sex, which is actually a title he says he doesn't really love, but it's a look at the queer scene in Berlin circa 1904, and it's amazing. It involves all these lesbian Mardi Gras balls and drag balls and weightlifting clubs and chess clubs and soccer leagues, and then he puts out a pamphlet on your right that means what people must know about the third sex, meaning what the German public needs to understand about queer people to stop oppressing them and to stop making queer life illegal. Hirschfeld creates this whole sort of kind of the linchpin behind this entire scene that we now know so well from Weimar Berlin. This is a portrait of a party held at Hirschfeld's Institute, which is founded in 1919, not coincidentally the year Germany becomes a democracy. He is seated in the glasses on the far right. You can see he's holding hands with Karl Giese, his partner, who's in a dress. I should say that in the European racial system, since Hirschfeld is Jewish and Giese is Christian, this is considered actually an interracial relationship, even though in the American racial system, this would be considered an intra-racial relationship. And then at the far left, that's actually Karl's mother. So Hirschfeld has these wonderful passages in a book like, for example, Berlin's Third Sex, where he talks about queer couples and how in Berlin, which has become so progressive, the mothers will often accept the queer partner of their child as a son-in-law or daughter-in-law. He doesn't break the third wall and say, and actually, I have a mother-in-law just like this. He's always trying to create some distance where he can be this kind of impartial man of science, writing about society. But as you read him, knowing the details of his life, you can see how his life is shaping his ideas. This is, as I said, the Institute for Sexual Science. This is, he purchases this right after World War I, when Germany becomes a democracy. It was the former residence of a nobleman and then an ambassador, and it's a mansion fronting on the Tiergarten, which is the central park of Berlin. It's about a 5 or 10 minute walk from the Reichstag. That's the parliament of the democratic Germany. It's about a 5 or 10 minute walk from the Lehrter Bahnhof. That is the main train station of the city where all the tourists from all over Europe and beyond come to Berlin. And this kind of pulls in people from the city and beyond into this institute. One reason Hirschfeld wanted this Parkside site was in his psychotherapy, he was not like Freud with the couch and the drapery and all of that. He believed in what we could call walk and talk therapy. He thought you would be best unburdening yourself if you're walking around the park with your therapist, Magnus Hirschfeld. So that's why this site appealed to him. Inside there were, some of his colleagues did this more, couch, heavy drapery, Freudian type of therapy, including Dr. Felix Abraham, shown here as the head of the trans psychotherapy unit in the institute with one of his patients. This is one of Dr. Abraham's prescription forms. And this is a real prescription form where ordinarily a doctor might write 20 milligrams of amoxicillin twice a day. But on this prescription form that Dr. Abraham has given one of his trans patients, there are 3 items. The first is Paul Riggers. Okay, Paul Riggers is the head of the Trans Club of Berlin. So the first part of the prescription is you need to meet the head of the Trans Club of Berlin and maybe start going to meetings and meet other trans people in Berlin. And then the final 2 items are Molly und Igel and Ariana. These are both trans-friendly nightclubs. So it's literally hit 2 bars and call me in the morning. And you can see this push towards self-acceptance and also this understanding that individualized psychotherapy, in the absence of changing society, creating safe spaces publicly, is not going to work. In the interest of creating this kind of safe public space, Magnus Hirschfeld convinces the Berlin Police Department to begin issuing these, what in German they call them trans passports. It's essentially a trans ID. So the law in Germany, as in much of Europe at the time, and actually in much of America at the time, is that it is illegal to wear clothing that does not correspond to your gender assigned at birth, except on Mardi Gras. And this permit permits the bearer, in this case an individual named Gerd Katter, to wear this clothing that does not conform to the gender assigned at birth all year round. So if there's ever a cop who asks, who wants to arrest them, they can pull this out of their pocket and show that they're permitted to dress as they please. The public heart of the Institute for Sexual Science is a museum, exhibition space, where the whole world of sexuality is presented to the public, and where this argument that Hirschfeld is making in his scientific journals is presented to the public, that gender and sexual orientation are continuum rather than binaries. The heart of the exhibit is this core exhibit, Magnus Hirschfeld's Sexual Transitions. You can see it's trilingual. It's in English, French, and German, much like the famed Broadway number, Willkommen, Bienvenue, Welcome. Using these 3 languages in Weimar, Berlin at the time was a way of channeling that your publication, theater piece, institution was speaking to the world, not merely to the city or even to the country, but to the world. And you can see here, these are portraits of the same individual in stereotypically male and stereotypically female clothing. These are drawn from Hirschfeld's patients. And one of the notable things, actually, is that they're generally unmasked. So in a lot of medical portraiture of this era, the patients are masked for anonymity. And here it's a real statement that the patients are out and proud. Hirschfeld immediately embraces film as a medium for reaching the public as soon as it's bubbling up really before World War I. By 1919, it's a major medium. It's silent film. He makes this film, this gay rights silent film called Anders als die Andern, which means different from the others. And the screenplay is essentially a kind of roman à clef about one of his patients from the early days of his practice who confided in Hirschfeld that he was secretly gay but was betrothed to a woman that was a family friend and commits suicide on the eve of his wedding to her and tells Hirschfeld he needs to take a public stand because private psychotherapy is not going to be enough. In the film, it's a concert violinist who's the protagonist, and he's blackmailed and outed, and his agent cancels all of his concerts, and he commits suicide taking pills. The protagonist is played by Conrad Veidt, who's one of the great silent film actors of that era. And the young violinist in the flashback scenes is played by Carl Giese, who is Hirschfeld's partner. Additionally, Hirschfeld is involved in the publication of this book, Berlin's Lesbische Frauen, which means Berlin's lesbian women. It's the world's first lesbian travel guide. It's written by Margarete Rellig, who is a bona fide Berlin lesbian. The foreword is written by Magnus Hirschfeld that explains that this is not merely a travel guide, but this is kind of a form of therapy. That if you were a lesbian from elsewhere in Germany or from a small town in France or a small town in Ireland and come to Berlin, with this book in hand, you can find the lesbian clubs. You can find there's a skating club. There's a Jewish lesbians chess club that meets in a cafe on Thursday afternoons. It's this huge, this enormous lesbian world, and this publication makes it accessible to anyone who would be interested in it. One of the many queer Europeans who are attracted to Berlin and move there, as an expat for a while in this period is Francis Bacon, who is a incredibly well-known Irish-born artist. Surely his work is, I'm sure it's in MoMA and the Met, and if you're interested in him, you could see it locally in New York or any of the world's great cities. And he makes the observation in his memoir that there was this interplay in Weimar Berlin between the day world of Hirschfeld's museum and the night world of the sex clubs. And the influence could go either way. So sometimes some kink would be displayed in the Hirschfeld Museum and then would appear on stage in a nightlife act in Berlin. But it could also go the other way. There could be some kinky nightlife act and Hirschfeld might be there at 2 a.m. and then, well, I didn't know that this was a thing, but clearly, it's getting butts in seats, so someone must be into this, and then document it in his sex museum. The most famous queer and trans-friendly club of the era, of which there were many, dozens and dozens, is this club, the El Dorado. You can see the gender personae of the individuals on the marquee, and the slogan, "Here is richtig," which means here it's right. Hirschfeld, we know, went there. We also know some people who became rather prominent Nazis went there in its heyday as well, which became one of the reasons why there was an interest in the Nazi Party in eliminating Hirschfeld and his files. In this club at this time, because of Hirschfeld's intellectual ideas about gender as a continuum, there was a new cultural space for gender nonconforming singers, actors, cabaret personalities. So you get people like Claire Waldorf, who's a butch lesbian star of the era. Her most famous song is called Raus mit der Männern, which means out with the men. And it's the argument that if Germany expelled all the men from parliament, its problems would all be solved. You also get figures like Anita Berber, who's a close friend of Hirschfeld. There are rumors that they hooked up, but like all the best rumors, probably not true. But here you have somebody who is picking their own gender persona by the night. So if you went to a nightclub and Anita Berber was on the marquee, you didn't know till the curtain went up which Anita Berber you were going to get. You might get this on your left, this drag king persona, which Berber called the Eton boy. It's kind of like a posh British aristocratic young man. Or this very femme fatale on the right, Anita Berber doing the cocaine dance in this corset dress, which leaves very little to the imagination. This world was under threat and, of course, did not survive much past 1933. You can see here the El Dorado Theater turned into the local Nazi Party office for the neighborhood. The sign where it used to say, "Here is right," says "Vote the Hitler List #1." This is propaganda. There's not going to be another free and fair election in Germany until 1945, or east of the wall till 1989. Magnus Hirschfeld decides in 1930, actually several years before Hitler seizes power, that life is getting dangerous for him in Germany. He's actually, in 1920, he's attacked in the streets of Munich by right-wing thugs. This is before the right-wing thug scene in Munich has even constituted itself into the Nazi Party. They're already attacking him. And he decides he's going to go over to America till the whole fascism thing blows over. In winter 1930-31. He goes to America, starts in New York, gives a series of lectures, and spends a fair amount of time in Harlem. He stays actually at the New Yorker Hotel across from Penn Station at 34th and 8th, and he zips up to Harlem, where he meets these individuals. This is on your left, Langston Hughes, famous queer African-American poet. On your right, Carl Van Vechten, the kind of self-appointed white ambassador to the Harlem Renaissance, and closeted bisexual. And they have a tea party together in Harlem. Hirschfeld, having been getting pushed out of Germany on ostensibly racial grounds, begins to become very interested in the American racial system. You know, the white Americans say, you know, well, downtown say, you know, we're white and we keep all the black Americans uptown. And then Hirschfeld goes uptown and he realizes, you know, a lot of these black Americans are lighter than a lot of the white Americans downtown, and maybe this racial system is not as hermetically sealed as the Americans are telling him. He continues this journey as fascism does not blow over, goes to Chicago, is able to give one, he's packaged in the United States as the Einstein of Sex by his PR agent, and is presented as a straight marriage therapist who's going to fix your straight marriage. Every so often in America, there are spaces where he can talk about his actual area of expertise, queer life. One of them is Chicago, and a very special and unusual place in 1930s America called the Dill Pickle Club. Can't make this up. He goes out to California, has an amazing kind of harrowing trip to San Quentin. He actually goes to meet with a political prisoner, an anarchist who'd been kind of locked up on trumped-up charges, and ends up in the touring San Quentin with the homophobic, racist warden. And they end up in the laundry room. And Hirschfeld realizes that the laundry room is filled with all of these femme black inmates and trans women inmates. So in California at the time, oral sex was illegal, no matter what, in any combination. But anyone familiar with the history of the United States would understand that the people prosecuted for this tended to be black gay men. They all end up in the laundry room at San Quentin. Hirschfeld is arguing that these prisoners first of all, these prisoners did not commit any real crime, that oral sex should not be a crime. It's violated flagrantly by people, you know, from the governor on down, and that, you know, their prosecution is really persecution. He does not have a lot of success with the racist, homophobic warden, but I think it is a really remarkable moment in history, you know, 1931, for an individual to be making these claims for the humanity of all. Hirschfeld's trip continues. Fascism doesn't blow over. He goes to Hawaii, has a really fascinating experience there. In Hawaii, in that era, already 1 in 4 marriages are interracial. In a time when most American states on the mainland, interracial marriage is illegal. In America where in many communities interracial dating is punishable by extrajudicial execution. Already, Hawaii has this interracial marriage as a quasi norm. He continues on to the Far East. He's been publishing in his journal about gender nonconforming communities all over the world, but he's finally able to see them. He goes to a matriarchal society in the Himalayas. He has this wonderful description in his book that he publishes about the polyandrous matriarch goes up the hill with her 5 husbands in tow, carrying all the heavy wares. They take out the stuff. She starts smoking. All she does is deal with the money. They do all the hard work, and then they load up the heavy packs at the end of the day and go back down the mountain. Here he is at an archaeological site in Indonesia, standing between 2 enormous carved stone penises that are 1,000 years old in a white suit. Great picture. He meets with this trans community in Indonesia, which is known under the term waria, which is, from my understanding of Bahasan Indonesia, which is Indonesian, which is limited, is a combination of the word for man and the word for woman. These are trans women. They've existed in Indonesia for as long as anyone can remember. were not stamped out by either the coming of Islam or the coming of Dutch colonialism. He, in Shanghai, meets Li Shutong, a Hong Kong-born medical student who introduces himself and offers his services as a translator. They are soon a couple. Karl has been left behind in Berlin to kind of mind the store at the Institute. And Hirschfeld and Li Shutong begin traveling the world together. Hirschfeld takes up the mantle of anti-imperialism, which is, again, rather far-sighted for a European in that era. He gives an interview to the English, and in part spurred by Li Shutong and his understanding the experience East Asian people of European racism are experiencing. He gives this interview to a Chinese English language paper in Shanghai where he says, Hirschfeld hits foreigners' idea of superiority. He says, foreigners are guests in China and need to respect the native people. He settles in France in exile. He never returns home. He hears from Karl, Karl leaves the day after the book burning, or the day after the raid, and meets Hirschfeld in Italy and tells him of the raid. Hirschfeld settles in France on the anniversary of the book burning. He opens this library of burned books where people in France, at least, can read the books in German, English, French, and other languages that had been burned by the Nazis. Hirschfeld publishes his travelogue. It's actually, in German, it's called Weltreise eines Sexualforschers, world journey of a sex researcher. In English, everything, sex in both US and Britain is kept closer to the vest, so it's under Women East and West is the English translation. And finally, he settles in the south of France and devotes the rest of his life to this debunking of Nazi race theory. So he has this really, the end of his life is a turn towards race. He's thrown out of his country on ostensibly racial grounds. He's involved with his new partner, Li Shutong, who's of East Asian ethnicity and can see how people of East Asian ethnicity are treated all over the world, including in the US-occupied Philippines, where they won't even let Li Shutong get off the boat because of Chinese exclusion. Li Shutong is from Hong Kong, which is a part of Britain at the time, and is kind of trying to explain to them that he's a subject of His Majesty George V, and of course the American border guards don't want to hear it. So this is Hirschfeld's final work, where he argues that there are no pure races, and ultimately we only share a race with our biological siblings, should we have any. He says if one day there's a blood test that can actually expose your ancestry, the anti-Semites will not be pleased with the results. As we now know, it wasn't a blood test, it's a cheek swab, but we all get these very complicated mosaics of our background when we get them. Certainly I did. And with that, I would love to open the floor to questions, both local and national and international, through the magic of the web. Thank you so much.
What was the eventual fate of Dr. Hirschfeld?
Dr. Hirschfeld, as I said, never returns to Germany again. He settles first in Paris and then in Nice on the French Riviera. On his 67th birthday, neither of his partners, Karl or Lee, can be there. He's there with friends, many drawn from the German Jewish diaspora at that point, who had also been thrown out of Germany, and with his nephew. And they go to the Café de France, and they have a blowout 67th birthday with many pastries. Hirschfeld was diabetic. From everything we know, it was, Karl and Lee would say, maybe you don't need the third eclair, Magnus. And there's no one there to kind of prevent it. On his walk home to his apartment building in Nice, he keels over, goes into a coma, is dead by the morning. Not a bad way to go, considering all of the options. I mean, one of his most famous neighbors, literally in the same apartment building in Nice, is a man named Theodor Wolff, who was the editor of the Berliner Tagblatt, the Berlin Daily News, which is kind of the establishment liberal equivalent of the New York Times. And he too thinks he has escaped the Nazis. After the fall of France, he's arrested and brought to Sachsenhausen, the concentration camp outside of Berlin, where he is killed.
Hi. Hello. You can just leave it on. I don't know. Hello.
We're having some miking issues that, for those of you online, we shall see if this is working. Julian, why don't you?
Yeah, I'll just yell it out. What was the impetus for you to research Magnus?
Sure. As I told you, I was a Jewish kid growing up on Long Island in the 90s and had probably more Holocaust education than was psychologically healthy at a young age, and didn't hear anything about Magnus Hirschfeld. And I stumbled into him in the Berlin Jewish Museum in 2009, which was the first time I got over my issues and went to Berlin. And had no idea, I'd never heard of him, and it was clear from the very small amount of information they had about him that A, he was an incredibly important figure, and also that his work as a queer rights activist, as a social democrat, as an intellectual, really made the Nazi anti-Semitism crystallize for me in a way I hadn't understood it. I grew up in the American racial context, where Jews are white. The racism of the Holocaust always seemed kind of strange. And in learning about Hirschfeld and his German Jewish, secular German Jewish world, I realized that a war against the Republic, a war to destroy democracy, had to be a war against the Jews. So that was part of the impetus. Then years later, I'd written a book on race in America during Reconstruction, particularly in New Orleans and Charleston, which have a more conscious understanding that race is a continuum. And I was in the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and there was a plaque that mentioned that the word racism did not exist until the 20th century, which was one of these like aha moments. Now that you mention it, yeah, I'd read a gazillion newspaper articles from like 1868 and 1876, and none of them used the word racism. They used white supremacy, bigotry, prejudice, other words. And I was looking up where the word racism comes from. Well, Magnus Hirschfeld. But he's much more famous for coining the word transvestite in 1910. In the process of all of this, my niece is transitioning. My niece, I would say, is kind of like, in Hirschfeld's work, he debunks this idea that there's an archetypal trans story. But if there were one, my niece would be the archetypal trans story. I mean, growing up, all of her video game avatars were females. She dressed as female movie stars for Halloween from age 6. And then to sort of learn that all of this, this understanding that I should have had, that had all been written down 100 years ago, and I certainly should have had, having undergone all that Holocaust education, had been swiped from me, made me want to read a book about Hirschfeld. And then the last English language biography of Hirschfeld is from like 1986. So it was time for a new one.
Thank you so much. We actually have several pretty pithy questions coming through the Q&A. So I'm not going to do them in any particular order. I think I'm going to ask you maybe 2 at a time. The first is, how do you think gender healthcare would have developed differently had Dr. Hirschfeld's library not been burned? Do you think there are perspectives or techniques permanently lost to time, or do you think we've gotten some of those back? Why don't we start there?
Yeah. I mean, one thing that really infuriates me is when people who are critical of trans healthcare talk about how rudimentary it is, or how unadvanced it is, or how we're experimenting on real live human subjects. We think of how much further ahead we would be had we not stopped doing trans research and trans healthcare for 100 years. And I should say that a lot of the issues that are being kind of litigated and revisited now were litigated and dealt with 100 years ago. Gerd Katter, the individual whose trans permit I showed you, they were 16 years old, living in not far from Berlin, The mother of the child realized that that their gender identity was, did not correspond to the gender assigned at birth, and said, this is a case for Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, and took their 16-year-old, to the institute, where the child insisted on having top surgery to the surgical clinic. The doctors meet. They said, well, they're thinking, can we perform top surgery on a minor, on a 16-year-old? And they initially decided, no, we're not going to perform top surgery on a minor. Gerd goes home, tries to perform this surgery on themselves with a razor blade. The mother comes back to the institute with Gerd now, bleeding and injured, and the doctors immediately decide to reverse course and pursue the surgery immediately.
It's incredibly sobering. And I think that builds on one of the questions that came in, which was what was the follow-up of his research on sexuality or race. Another question, and I just want to preface this by saying there's a lot of commentary about what is happening now in our society. So I'll just ask the one large question. Seeing parallels between the current political climate and attempts to erase and suppress LGBTQI plus people abroad and the rise of authoritarianism. What is it that you want readers to take away from this book? Is it a call to action? Is it a way to tell us something about Magnus's story? And what are your thoughts on the current attacks on U.S. libraries and book burnings around this content?
Okay, I should say I'm as horrified, but also as shocked at the state of the world where we find ourselves today. This was not the world I thought I was dropping this book into. I think Hirschfeld has a tremendous amount to teach us now. The final chapter gets into his final book, Racism, where he explores, there's a literal Nazi slogan, like actual Nazi slogan, Rassenkampf statt Klassenkampf, which means race war instead of class war. Nazis were very overt that they were turning they were turning the anger of the German people who were suffering from hyperinflation and from loss of the war and unfair peace terms onto racial others, gender others. So he has and then his theory is a kind of antidote to fascism. Whereas when anyone is telling you it's us and them, you can see through it and see that we're all we. Mm-hmm. So I
Absolutely.
think that's a crucial lesson at this moment. The other thing I want to say is that there's a passage in Timothy Snyder's very short and very worthwhile book on tyranny, where he says, we as people are no different from the people who lived in European societies 100 years ago that collapsed into totalitarianism and authoritarianism. The only advantage we have is that we can learn from their experiences. And some days I'm heartened at how much we've learned, and some days I'm in despair at how little we've learned.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel, I have another question from online. This person asks, can you talk about Hirschfeld's philosophy on feminism and whether he showed an equal interest in supporting queer women as he did men?
That is a really good question. I would say Hirschfeld has blind spots when it comes to women, but not as many blind spots as most men in his society did. His organization is founded by men. I should say, under the law in Germany, it was actually legal to have lesbian sex. It was only criminalized for a man to have sex with a man. A woman could have sex with a woman with impunity, and that did make, that contributed to gay men being the core of the movement. But as he moves forward in his career, more and more lesbian women want to be part of this movement, and he becomes more and more open to having them be part of the movement. He's an advocate for women's suffrage. His sister, Franziska Hirschfeld-Mann, is a pretty major suffrage activist in Germany. So there's more in the book, but I think that's it in kind of a nutshell.
And speaking of the book, what lessons do you think current journalists can take away from your research and the stories you're presenting today, especially during a moment where the transgender community is at the center of a culture war in the US and abroad?
I think one thing I've learned doing this project more than other projects that I do I'm a journalist, but I'm drawn to history, and I've done more and more history as in my career has moved along, is how much of what we know about Berlin before the Nazis is not because it was written down in some history book, but because of a kind of wildcat, seat of the pants, DIY history collection of diaries, like that trans permit that I showed. That's held at something called the Magnus Hirschfeld Gesellschaft in Berlin, the Magnus Hirschfeld Society. Magnus Hirschfeld Society was created by a bunch of gay men in West Berlin in the 70s who started hearing rumors at the bars and cafes that, like, before World War II, you wouldn't recognize this place. It was the center of the gay world. They had no idea. And they decided to start collecting testimonies and documentation. Gerd Katter was living as a carpenter in East Germany, had to cross the Berlin Wall, had to get a permit to cross the Berlin Wall to give this permit to the founders of this research archive. That's how real history is done. It's not just written down.
So it's learning from, it's not just about.
Yeah, and preserve your stuff and put your emails in the cloud in Canada and all that. Yeah.
So I have another question for you, because I saw you present a couple months ago, and I think both you and the other author had talked about how you've presented widely on your other books, but this time around it's been a little bit different.
Yeah. One's a fluke, two's a coincidence, three's a conspiracy. I've had more than 3 NEH grant-funded history museums and archives and institutions where I've presented previously, somehow scheduling difficulties, not be able to host an event on this book. I have a friend who is in urban studies at a major university that's being threatened by the Trump administration. He's in charge of the lecture series. He said, usually our lecture series is 8 speakers. This year, because we're being squeezed we're being strangulated by the Trump administration, it's 3 speakers. He said, if it was 8 speakers, you could be one of them. If it's 3 speakers, it has to be from this very narrow band of people, like at the very center of the field. What's going on now is definitely affecting my ability to get this message out.
Before we wrap up, are there any other questions in the room here? Yes.
I just had a question about your research process, in the context of the book burning and the limited information you mentioned. How did you overcome obstacles with finding the information? You documented a lot of travel and different things like that. What was your process?
Yeah. So I started this project a few months before the pandemic happened. So I had this kind of plan that went awry. One thing I did. My German is still not very good, but I began learning, and I'm still learning German. I was fortunate enough to get a fellowship named after Ina and Robert Caro, the greatest living biographers in the English language and researchers, to go to Berlin, go to archives, but also go to the site. Go to the site where they burned the books, go to the site where the institute stood. It was destroyed in the war, but it's marked, and there's all kinds of information. Got to meet Ralph Does, who the DIY historian who's now in his 70s, who got that permit. So all of those research methods, and then reading widely. The other thing is they didn't destroy everything. They tried to destroy everything they couldn't. There are a handful of books. A colleague has one that's stamped with the institute logo, from the library. That movie, the Nazis tried to destroy all the copies of it. An almost complete copy was found in a Soviet film archive in Moscow in the 70s, and you can now watch it on Vimeo tonight if you want. Yeah.
Are there any other questions in the classroom? I think we have 1, 2.
Just following up on that, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about obviously we know how much was destroyed, but what was destroyed versus what was able to be kept, what was survived. For example, you were talking a little bit before about some of the books being available in France and stuff like that.
Yeah, one of the reasons, as suppressed as Hirschfeld was, and I would say he was heavily suppressed like in the United States and the Soviet Union, the two victors of the war. Both countries had a kind of queer positive 20s and 30s and had a very anti-queer 1950s. Here in the US has a lavender scare. Soviet Union legalized gay sex after the revolution and then recriminalizes it under Stalin in the 50s. So that's where some of it went. Thankfully, Hirschfeld was like an incredibly successful individual in his time. So there's like, that pamphlet was huge bestseller. That book, Berlin's Third Sex, was huge. Some of them were actually preserved by the Nazis. They would put the banned books in something called a Giftschrank. It's like the poison chest. This is happening again today, right? The books that you could access them only if you were going to write against them, but they would be kept in the library. And then by the end of Hirschfeld's life, towards the end, he's big enough that all of his books are coming out in French and English and other languages simultaneously. And by the end, that last book comes out in English because there's no German publishing house that can put out an anti-Nazi book at that point.
That speaks, that's pretty intense. Anyone else? Oh, we've got a question in the back. Thanks to everybody that's also online.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the American reaction to his publications on race?
Yeah, so he is, he's in an interesting spot, right? He's been thrown out of Germany. Well, the first time he comes to America, he's in a fun spot where he's in his 20s and he's never been overseas and he's covering, he's based in Chicago and he's covering American social life and covering the fair, the World's Fair in Chicago. That's like a huge thing. And also like a kind of intensely racist nightmare where the Midway Park, which is still in Chicago if you go, is set up as this kind of human zoo. Where peoples from all over the world are kind of shipped in to play themselves. They have these Alaskan natives that they make them dance in the heavy furs that they wear in Alaska in the middle of a Chicago summer. They have like an African village. It's kind of awful. And Hirschfeld's articles from that era are not bylined, so there's no definitive way to kind of figure out exactly what he's doing. Then when he comes back to America in the 30s, he knows he's kind of on thin ice, right? Because he can't just go home. So he doesn't totally want to poke the bear. But in his journal, his personal journal, he has all kinds of things about how this is not a sanely ordered society. And then in this book, Women East and West, which is really World Journey of a Sex Researcher, a good deal of that is the debunking of the anti-miscegenation myth. The American English word mulatto for a mixed race person comes from the word mule. The idea was that actually mixed race people, like mules, would be incapable of reproducing. And there were all kinds of ideas about mixed race people would be mentally enfeebled or weak or have bad lungs or all of this. So a lot of that book is debunking that. I should say Hirschfeld is never welcome to any antebellum slave state, like it's the 30s, the slavery's been abolished, including Washington, D.C. So he sees all of America. He never even goes to the Capitol. So his America tour is sort of limited by where any poking at the American system of race will even be entertained, even if it's dismissed.
I have another question from online. And this person asks, were there any precursor to his ideas, persons, organizations, schools, or did he arise Athena-like from his own head?
No, I mean, a lot of his ideas, I think his brilliance is beyond dispute, but there are antecedents, particularly in Germany. There's a gay lawyer named Hans Ulrichs, who is about a generation before Hirschfeld, and speaks out against this paragraph 175 law. He takes the stage at a bar association conference for German lawyers and is laughed and heckled off the stage. He ends up moving to Italy, where actually there is never a law against criminalizing homosexuality, and kind of lives the rest of his days sort of like writing Latin poetry in Italy. and his works are suppressed. And actually, Hirschfeld publishes them in his journal in the early 20th century. These texts are 50 years old at that point, but to try to get them more widely distributed. So he does have antecedents. Franz Boas, who's a figure, a German Jewish immigrant figure who's one of the anthropologists at Columbia University at the time, is also arguing that against racist ideas. And Boas is given an exhibit hall at the Chicago World's Fair, wherein basically, while there's this kind of human zoo on the Midway, there is this one space in the fair that's kind of pushing an anti-racist ideology. And again, Hirschfeld's articles from the fair have been lost, but we can be pretty sure that Hirschfeld encountered this as, there's another German Jewish guy at the fair who's created a building, probably saw that, so.
So we'd like to thank you, Daniel, for this enlightening presentation. And I also like to thank everyone for their attendance, those who are with us in person and online. And just to give a plug for this book, if you have not read it, you really should read it. It is a terrific book, wonderfully written, a combination of a history of Magnus Hirschfeld, but also a history of Berlin during this time period. So thank you once again, Daniel.
Thank you. And for those of us who are here, I'll happily sign your copies.
Online. We appreciate your support of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center. Please check out our website for upcoming events. And this event, as all of them, are recorded and posted to our website's recording page a few days after they've been captioned. Stay safe, be well. Thank you.